Good evening everyone. I'm the storyteller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The Shadow on Mill Hill. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of Mill Hill, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. The old mill stood like a forgotten sentinel on the edge of the woods, its broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. The townsfolk of Black Hollow had long since stopped speaking of it, except in hushed tones when the moon was high and the shadows stretched long. They called it cursed. They called it haunted. But no one dared to say why. It was the kind of place that made you feel watched, even when you were alone. The kind of place where the air seemed to thicken, and the silence pressed against your ears like a weight. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the stories, people were drawn to it. Like moths to a flame. Like prey to a predator. The new family didn't know any of this when they moved into the old farmhouse just down the road. The Millers, Tom, Sarah, and their 12-year-old daughter, Ellie, had come from the city, seeking a quieter life. The farmhouse was cheap, the land was beautiful, and the town seemed friendly enough. At first. Tom Miller was the first to notice the shadow. It was late afternoon, and he was unloading boxes from the back of their SUV when he felt it, a cold prickle at the base of his neck, like someone was watching him. He turned, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing there. Just the wind stirring the leaves and the distant silhouette of the mill on the hill. "You're imagining things," he muttered to himself, shaking off the feeling. But as he turned back to the car, he caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. A shadow, darker than the others, slipping between the trees. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. When he looked again, it was gone. That night, as the family sat around the dinner table, Tom mentioned what he'd seen. Sarah laughed it off, calling it country jitters, but Ellie's eyes widened with interest. "Do you think it's a ghost?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. "Don't be silly," Sarah said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "There's no such thing as ghosts." But Tom wasn't so sure. He'd seen something. He just didn't know what. The days passed, and the shadow didn't return. The Millers settled into their new routine, and the farmhouse began to feel like home. Tom started work at the local hardware store, Sarah began painting again, and Ellie made friends at school. Life was good. But then the noises started. It began with a faint tapping at the windows, like branches scraping against the glass. Tom checked outside, but there were no trees close enough to reach the house. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone, or something, was trying to get in. Then came the footsteps. Soft at first, barely audible over the creak of the floorboards. But as the nights wore on, they grew heavier, more deliberate. Tom and Sarah would lie awake, listening as the footsteps paced the hallway outside their bedroom door. They never opened the door. They didn't want to see what was on the other side. Ellie, however, seemed unfazed. She claimed she never heard the noises, and when her parents pressed her, she just shrugged and said, "Maybe it's the wind." But Tom knew better. The wind didn't leave footprints in the dust on the stairs. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie announced that she was going to explore the woods. Tom and Sarah exchanged worried glances. "It's getting dark," Sarah said. "Why don't you wait until tomorrow?" "I'll be fine," Ellie insisted, already pulling on her jacket. "I just want to see the mill." Tom's stomach dropped. "The mill? Why?" Ellie shrugged. "I don't know. It's cool. And everyone at school says it's haunted." "It's not safe," Tom said firmly. "You're not going." Ellie rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She went to her room instead, slamming the door behind her. That night, the noises were worse than ever. The tapping turned to pounding, the footsteps to stomping, and Tom thought he heard a low, guttural whisper coming from the walls. He lay in bed, clutching Sarah's hand, his heart racing. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "This place, it's not right." Sarah didn't argue. For the first time since they'd moved in, she looked scared. But it was too late. The next morning, Ellie was gone. Her bed was empty, her window wide open. Tom and Sarah searched the house, the yard, the woods, calling her name until their voices were hoarse. But there was no sign of her. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Tom's gaze drifted to the mill on the hill. A cold knot of dread tightened in his chest. "She's there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know she is." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We have to call the police." "No," Tom said, his voice firm. "This is something we have to do ourselves." They set off toward the mill, the air growing colder with each step. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. The mill loomed ahead, its broken windows like gaping wounds. As they approached, Tom felt that same cold prickle at the back of his neck. He turned, scanning the trees, and there it was, the shadow. Darker than the others, moving with purpose. It slipped between the trees, heading toward the mill. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. "We're not alone," he whispered. Sarah gripped his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "What is that?" "I don't know," Tom said. "But we're going to find out." They stepped inside the mill, the air thick with dust and decay. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic thrum. Tom's flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. "Ellie!" Sarah called, her voice echoing through the empty space. "Ellie, where are you?" There was no answer. They moved deeper into the mill, the darkness pressing in around them. The thrum grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the walls themselves were alive. And then they saw it. A shadow, darker than the others, standing at the far end of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. And at its feet lay Ellie, her eyes wide with terror. "Ellie!" Tom shouted, rushing toward her. But the shadow moved faster, its form expanding to fill the room. Tom and Sarah were thrown back, their bodies slamming against the wall. The shadow loomed over them, its form twisting into something almost human. A face emerged from the darkness, its features twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "But now that you're here, you'll never leave." Tom struggled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want?" The shadow's smile widened. "Your fear. Your pain. Your souls." Sarah screamed as the shadow lunged, its form engulfing them in darkness. The last thing Tom saw was Ellie's face, her eyes filled with tears, before the world went black. The townsfolk of Black Hollow never spoke of the Millers. They never spoke of the shadow on Mill Hill. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the moon was high and the wind howled through the trees, they would hear the faint sound of footsteps pacing the old mill. And they would lock their doors, draw their curtains, and pray that the shadow would never come for them. Because the shadow was always waiting. And it was always hungry. The end.